Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining. My name is Nick. I am the Group Director of Solution Architecture at Integrity360. And today's webinar is around deepfakes and AI impersonation. And this will be the best webinar you attend this year. No question. It's been very well received at our Security First events. I'm delighted that I'm being joined by Brian, my colleague, the Group Director of Product Management at Integrity360, who's going to be running today's session. Let me just set the quick scene on this. You know, the AI, deepfakes and AI. It's Brian and I have been working in the detection and response arena for quite some time now. As the market has matured, we are seeing a significant influx of major incident response queries and requests regarding deepfakes and AI. This is real, to put it quite simply. And I think that it is well worth listening in today. And Brian really brings this to life within the preceding webinar. So yeah, Brian, without further ado, over to you. Yeah.
Thank you, Nick, and good afternoon, everyone who joined. So yeah, we keep hearing about the rise of AI, generative AI, and deepfakes. And the question is it just sensationalism, or is it something we need to genuinely be concerned about? So just a couple of quick statistics. Last year, deepfake attempts occurred at a rate of 1 every 5 minutes. And notably, the rate of occurrence is increasing. So basically what we're seeing is last year, it really grew quite significantly, and that rate is continuing to accelerate. So therefore, it's definitely becoming more common in terms of something we need to face. Secondly, in terms of biometric fraud, deepfakes now account for 40% of all biometric fraud. So certainly in the whole identity space, again, deepfakes is an area of great concern. And as we all know, identity is a core part of cybersecurity. Notwithstanding, it also plays a significant role in fraud as well. And just to see how quickly things are moving, this is now almost all news, right? Because this came out, whatever it was, 2 to 3 months ago. The Omni-Human 1 model, which was one of the first models to be able to just take a still image of somebody, couple it with some audio, and create lifelike videos. So for example, here's the Omni-Human 1 model, taking as an input a still picture of Albert Einstein from a lecture in 1921 in Vienna and turning it into effectively a live video.
What would art be like without emotions? It would be empty. What would our lives be like without emotions? They would be empty of values. So a famous classical poet said, "We hate and we love. Can one tell me why?" Catullus. Science does not answer why questions.
I think you can see from that it's getting much more powerful and more realistic. And we're seeing this across many different facets of image, video generation, and the ability to create deepfakes. So what is a deepfake? It's a synthetic media. It typically includes images, video, audio, and text, using deep learning techniques to generate them, and often includes a combination of generative AI methods, ultimately to create a very realistic representation of a subject. What is a deepfake for? What is their purpose? Ultimately, it's about impersonating an identity. And you can impersonate an identity for many different reasons, and they can be benign reasons. Very often they're used for amusement and entertainment, as we see quite a lot online, whether it's funny videos of Donald Trump and Elon Musk, to all sorts of different types of constructed characters, either real or imagined. But also they can be used for distributing disinformation, ultimately to damage somebody's reputation. It can be used for fraud, for social engineering, bypassing authentication, and ultimately it's a step in the attack chain. So it's a way for a threat actor to effectively leverage an exposure, typically a human exposure, or maybe an identity verification process in order to gain access. So there are a number of kind of primary vectors for the misuse of deepfakes. The first one is in digital communications. So they can be used to generate fake video, audio, and messaging. They can be used for influence operations, so creating fake online content. They can be used to fool face and voice authentication mechanisms as part of biometric authentication processes. And in a whole range of applications and submissions processes where one has to verify an identity, they can be used to fake identity verification processes and all that ensues from that. So I'm going to quickly just cover these 4 vectors and just some of the current aspects around them. So starting with deepfakes and digital communications, I like to think of this as social engineering 2.0. Because if you think about it, social engineering has been going on forever. And in the digital era, the primary social engineering vector has traditionally been email, email phishing attempts and such like, or over the phone, text messages and so forth. And really, deepfakes take social engineering to a new level, to 2.0. And starting with voice, I was kind of staggered when I looked into this a bit and found how easy it is to clone a voice. So for example, there's lots of content from me available on our website and online, just based on various presentations, webinars, etc. So here's some content that I grabbed from a webinar I did late last year. It's available on our website. It's available on our YouTube channel. So it's trivially easy to grab that.
And the most important thing I think to think about exposure management is that attackers chain exposures to build attack paths within your environment. We're all familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework.
So this is relevant, obviously, just to demonstrate this content is available, and also I'm actually talking about exposure management, and you can think about leveraging the human element of security as being also a step in an attack chain as part of exposure management. So anyway, it's so easy to download the content, take the audio out, and there's a plethora of tools available now for next to nothing to take audio from someone's voice and create a voice clone. Once you have cloned someone's voice, obviously the more audio you have, the better the voice clone, but now the tools are saying you can get a fairly decent approximation in the region of 10 seconds of somebody's voice. Obviously, if you can get 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, as is available in this webinar, then you can get an extremely good representation of someone's voice. And then once you have that, you can get someone to say anything. So just taking a little bit of poetry, I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, etc., etc. So that's me speaking William Wordsworth. And then here's me, my voice clone, doing the same.
I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze.
So I think you can tell, certainly it sounds to me, and I know your own voice often sounds different to yourself than to other people, but it certainly sounds like my voice in terms of what I've heard recordings of myself in the past. Now there is a positive to deepfakes. So on the plus side, I now speak dozens of languages. So once you have a clone, you can get that to speak pretty much any language. And you can think about the opportunity and the global scalability this gives a threat actor then to target different markets for their malicious activities. So for example, Here's me in fluent Swedish.
Jag vandrade ensam som ett moln som flyter på höga dalar och kullar när jag på en gång såg ett hav, en mängd gyllene påskliljor. Bredvid sjön under träden fladdrar och dansar i vinden.
So what are the use cases for this, for voice cloning? Well, obviously, you can receive voicemails, audio messages that sound like they're from someone you trust, from family member, from a colleague, from a boss. They can also be used in live audio conversations. Also, in the modern era of video conferencing, Teams, Zoom, etc., how many people go off camera and say, "Oh, my camera is playing up today," and they just stay on voice only, and a voice clone can be used to fake someone in that context. And very often, voice clones can be combined with video deepfakes to create a very compelling representation of somebody. Generally, what we see is a combination of deepfakes, of starting out with messaging and then moving to audio, and sometimes even video getting involved from a deepfake perspective. So typically, the attackers masquerade as some form of legitimate authority with an urgent request, very similar to typical phishing type engineering attacks. They lure the person using personalized messages, often gathering information online, which can often also use AI tools to gather that information and put together very compelling messages with Gen AI ensuring correct language, spelling, grammar, and associated sense of urgency. And then promoting onwards to to move to another channel if they're disbelieved. They're often combined with other forms of deepfakes, such as the cloned voice audio messages and doctored pictures and videos. Last year, Ferrari, this is just one small example, but they were targeted by a deepfake attack where an employee was targeted with somebody purporting to be the CEO. And this started with messaging, and they then moved on to a phone call where deepfake audio was being played of the CEO. It was only after some period of time where the employee got suspicious about something, felt a bit off, and they asked the caller about a book recommendation they'd made the previous week. And of course, the caller wasn't the CEO and didn't have any knowledge and hung up. But that just became reported as one small example of many out there of both messaging and voice cloning being combined to conduct an attack. We have another attack that happened. It's a UK-based company with offices in Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong-based worker was tricked. Started out initially with messages from the CFO about some financial transactions that were urgently required. They were suspicious, but were ultimately called onto a video call on a common video conferencing platform where the employee was on a call purportedly with the CFO and other parts of the management team. And it turns out that the attackers had used publicly available video footage of staff members to create deepfake video and audio to be used during this staged conference call. And there was multiple AI-generated personas and pre-generated content clips played in real time. Ultimately, the employee left the call believing that they had just had a meeting with the key kind of principals in the business and followed subsequent instructions to remit $25 million to 5 different bank accounts. So, and that was over a year ago now, and we've seen a rapid acceleration in the tools supporting this type of activity since then, but that's just one kind of very public example of where that happened. Also, the ability then to swap identities in real time is developing quite quickly, and real-time face swapping is now publicly available. There are a number of tools and applications available, many of them open source, that are available for download. Available on GitHub. You can download to your your own device, install it, and these applications also plug into traditional conferencing tools like Teams and Zoom, where you can swap someone else's face onto your own one in real time. And there's just an example video showing a variety of different faces being swapped in real time. So obviously that's not JD Vance or Hugh Grant, but the person behind that is making all those gestures, and the face swapping technology is swapping in the alternate face. Where we're seeing this actually used quite heavily in the last months is in recruitment fraud. And if you think about if you hire someone into your organization who isn't who they purport to be, it's the ultimate Trojan horse, the ultimate insider. And the FBI has for some months now been warning of a rising North Korean cyber threat where they are using AI to get hired as remote IT workers into organizations across, the US and Western Europe, for actually multiple purposes. There's whole teams of them working together who then get as many remote jobs as possible, and they all help each other to actually do the job that's required because they're all fairly IT savvy. And they that way pull in, they have these teams, these cells of teams, and they pull in millions of dollars in revenue for the North Korean government. But secondly, obviously, these type of workers are typically have privileged access, because they're typically being hired into IT type roles, and that provides a fantastic platform for them to exfiltrate data, to deploy malware, ransomware, and conduct other types of fraud. So we see lots of examples of people saying that they almost fell for these things and then twigged it at the last minute. But it's clearly the case that not everybody is detecting it in time and actually could, have these types of individuals within their organizations. We've seen examples of this more locally as well. So this is not just confined to the US. We're seeing it everywhere. So the next topic then is around influence operations. And really the goal of this type of activity and deepfake misuse is the rapid viral spread of misinformation, disinformation, fake news. And typically there's platform-specific content generated. There's targeting a specific audience. And it's all about rapid content distribution, because if the fake news is deployed and let's say it's viewed 10 million times within the first few hours, no matter how good the PR capability is of the targeted organization or individual, you're never going to get to all of those individuals and dispute them of the facts of what they've just learned about whatever was being targeted. So, whether this is in the political sphere or in the corporate sphere or just generally, targeting individuals, it is something that deepfake technology is providing a platform to support. And now it's so easy now just to get anyone to say anything. I showed earlier how easy it is to clone a voice. Well, now you can also then take an image of somebody and then just put words in their mouth. So here's some lip syncing of literally a thumbnail I took from the video of the downloaded webinar, and then applied the voice clone to it. And all these, if you do a Google search, you'll find in 2 minutes dozens of these types of tools available.
I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze.
And that was pretty much the first tool I picked, and I didn't even do a whole lot of research or trial and error to try and get it, really, really perfect. But it is very, very easy to do things like this. So you can imagine the possibilities now for creating disinformation and misrepresenting somebody by using this technology. It's also possible to preserve identities in video generation. So the early AI tools, you could give it a descriptor and then it could create a video. Now you can say, give it a descriptor, give it an image and say, put this identity into this video. So for example, a young boy with brown hair crouching by a stream in a dense forest. Please put this person into the video, and bang, you get a video with that identity placed into the exact scene that you have specified. An older gentleman with a beard, with cycling on a bike with the mountain behind them. A little girl dressed in a green and yellow dinosaur costume, even down to the color of the sofa behind. A man in a sharp suit with a steaming cup of coffee. And it's not even single identities. You can also inject multi-party identities into a scene and then determine what scene you would like to create. So for example, these two individuals, put them in front of an easel in a studio and have the camera zoom in. Or put these three people fiercely discussing a maths problem in front of the blackboard. So as you can see here, that it's so easy now to take an identity, put it into a scene of your making. So you can imagine the possibilities, the malicious possibilities of creating misinformation and disinformation. For example, you could put two identities in a scene, having a shady conversation in a cafe, if you wanted by implication to have, say, when two people are colluding on something or whatever, and then put that out online and distribute it virally. And there's different types of video deepfakes now. So you can do the face swaps, where the new face is superimposed on the target head, or it can be fully generated by generative AI that's been trained to produce very realistic scenes with a lot of background activity going on. And as I said, preserving identities as well. So there's lots of impacts for disinformation deepfakes. It can have a huge impact for individuals. So it can impact reputation, your career. You can get doxxed so that you get outed in the physical world. People know where you live and can target you. It can result in physical and online intimidation, and the threat or the actual reality of violence can be translated through these types of activities. And I wouldn't just dismiss this type of activity into the political sphere either. For-profit enterprises have been and can be targeted, and it can result in significant reputational damage, stock price impacts, market value, customer defection, brand perception. For example, hacktivism, or just for the plain hell of it, sometimes some organization could be targeted. And then finally, in the not-for-profit sphere, it can impact an organization in terms of their public support, their political support, funding, donation, volunteers, and collaboration from other parties and things like that. So all of these impacts can hit an organization if they're the victim of disinformation. The third area then is biometric use cases, and fooling face and voice authentication mechanisms is a prime use case for deepfakes, for malicious use of deepfakes. So automated voice recognition is often used in the likes of contact centers and help desks, and some mobile applications use voice recognition to help verify an identity. And these can be targeted using deepfakes, by using deepfake cloned audios, cloned voices, and then using text to speech to get the person to speak whatever it is required. On the video side, then, a lot of identity verification processes include automated biometric face recognition. They're becoming more common. We see them, we all use them on our laptops and on our mobile devices and in various applications. They can be targeted using deepfake images and video. And there are two types of attacks in terms of fooling face recognition. One is a presentation attack, where you literally put something in front of the camera to pretend it's you. So it can be a printout, or it can be some a lot of the verification processes now look for liveness, movement, and depth, and so therefore a still image isn't enough, but a deepfake video then could be enough and can be used then in a presentation attack through those mechanisms. There's also a more sophisticated one called injection attacks, and that's where there's a virtual camera created on the system. So the camera doesn't actually physically exist, but the system sees it as a virtual camera, and then the deep fake gets injected in through the virtual camera. And also there's another step beyond that, is that there isn't even a virtual camera, where just the deep fake is injected directly into the network stream. Is another sophisticated form of deep fake attack. And then the last area then is in terms of applications and submissions. And identity fraud is a huge concern for businesses who a core part of their business process is to verify customer identities. A lot of organizations in the financial sector have regulation mandating KYC processes, or know your customer, to ensure anti-money laundering and anti-criminal activities, as well as just purely to safeguard themselves against fraud also. And we can see that there's a big increase in the use of audio and video deepfakes over the last couple of years in relation to the use of deepfakes as part of these processes. So similar techniques can be used with the biometric authentication in terms of these processes. So the use of presentation and injection attacks that I talked about. Often these are used in conjunction with stolen or fake or doctored IDs, because these processes often use a combination of video, imagery, and IDs in combination in order to verify the identity. And there's a massive 17x increase in digital forgery has been detected in the last 3 years. So if you go back 3 years ago, most of the forgery was on physical documents, on IDs. That is now completely shifted. It's massively more the case that the majority of ID fraud is now on the digital side, very often using AI tools in order to manipulate images like that. And this deepfakes in this category can be used to misuse legitimate stolen identities. So if your identity gets stolen, then somebody else may open a bank account or might open some other form of an account in your name. But also, they are also increasingly being used for the creation of synthetic identities. So these are identities that don't actually exist in the real world at all. So in both cases, in the first case, there's a lot of harm for the person whose identity has been stolen. In the second case, there's a lot of harm in both cases, there's a lot of harm for the organization who's running these processes. Because obviously, if you're, say, a lending institution where you verify someone's identity and then you lend them a lot of money, and then those identities vaporize in a puff of smoke because they don't actually exist in the real world. So I've thrown a lot at you there in terms of the four main vectors of misuse of deepfakes. So what's the conclusion and recommendations around this? Well, we've a long time said in cybersecurity that really cybersecurity comes down to the golden triangle of people, process, and technology. And dealing with the advent of deepfakes is no different. On the people side, we're dealing with social engineering 2.0. So stay aware and vigilant around this rising threat and the possibilities, and educate yourself and your people around these forms of attacks and the fact that they are evolving very, very quickly. And stay up to date, because even in the process of making these presentations over the last couple of months, I see an evolution of the tooling and the capabilities that are out there and the novel forms of attack that are emerging. Really tighten up on remote hiring. We all became comfortable with remote hiring and remote working and hybrid working during COVID and post-pandemic. And and that's fine. And obviously, you know, remote and hybrid working is perfectly legitimate, but really we need to tighten up the hiring processes and identity verification around that to ensure we're really hiring who we think we are. Evaluate and make processes more robust to deepfake social engineering. So I would say it's really important to look at what critical processes you have in your business. Prime examples being hiring, as I just mentioned, but also financial transactions, you know, making payments, adding payees, changing payee details, and the sharing of sensitive or proprietary information or customer information. Evaluate those and see how susceptible they are to just somebody being fooled by a deepfake, and tighten up so that it's not possible for a single deepfake attempt to bypass those processes that you have. And also test regularly. So the same way we test our other defenses and controls, make sure you test those as well. Monitor for brand and VIP misuse and disinformation. So there are tools and capabilities out there to see what is being said in your name online, you know, whether it's fake phishing websites or social media impersonation of your brand or your own personnel. So there's digital risk protection services and brand protection monitoring and things like that that are available and have been available for some time. And also have a response plan in place for disinformation, because the quicker you can get out with a response, the better you can at least contain the misinformation, get it taken down as quickly as possible. And the same way we advocate that you have a response plan for cybersecurity, you should also have a response plan for mis and disinformation. Look at your authentication methods. Obviously, we've known for some time multi-factor authentication is critical. So someone can't get in with just a password. But also, when you're thinking about MFA, maybe don't just rely on biometric only. So consider biometric and non-biometric elements to your authentication processes. If you're involved with identity verification, really validate the tools and processes you're using to mitigate against those new presentation and injection attacks that I mentioned. And then for many years now, particularly last 2 to 3 years, there's been the rise of what we've talked about, zero trust. And I think zero trust is really becoming a greater imperative in the age of deepfakes, because at least now, then if somebody is authenticated into the environment, then at least it's least privilege. So they don't get in and get keys to the kingdom, right? They get in and they get access only to a very defined scope. And also the continuously verify aspect of zero trust will make it harder for someone to kind of achieve their goals just by having one successful deepfake attempt as well. So I think zero trust we'd advocate anyway in the modern era, but even more important in the context of deepfakes. So Nick, that's me done. So happy to hand back to you for finishing out the presentation.
Thank you, Brian. Really insightful stuff, and I hope that the audience also found it useful today. As I say, this is something we've ran a variant of our security first events, and it's very, very well received. This is real, you know, that's a reality. I said it at the beginning, I'll say it again. You know, we're seeing influx of support requests within our digital forensics major incident response team regarding this topic. So I think it really is important to double down on. I think if I was call out one, I think it's education. You know, I think we absolutely must be doing the training and education part to make people aware of the significance of this evolving area. And we have had some questions in, Brian, as well, as we've been running through there. I think Alex, your question regarding real-time voice calling, I think Brian actually covered that shortly after you actually asked the question, but short answer is yes. There are dozens of real-time voice cloning tools available readily on the market to make this very, very simple. Yeah, so I'll take that one quickly, Brian. We've had another one just in terms of It's a good question, a broad question, but a very good question. Who could we trust nowadays, Brian? I'll let you take that one. I may add something to that as well.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And the way I position it is that we should trust the same people that we've always trusted, or at least use the same or heightened processes for, evolving to trust somebody as we've always done. Because the advent of deep fake is not about trusting a person, it's about trusting the identity that's being presented to you. Is it really the person that you trust, or is it actually not the person you trust? So I think it's important to think about it that we're not trying to say, that suddenly you can't trust people that you used to trust, but I think it's more about, can you trust that the identity you're interacting with is actually genuinely the person you think you're interacting with? So the same, methods apply the same way that, we've always said around social engineering, is that you should, certainly if you have a sense in your gut that there's something a little bit off, then, independently verify, by using an alternative outreach to the individual to confirm it is the person that you think it is, and that they confirm that it is them and it's a genuine request and you understand the context. But then also that the same way that I said at the end, to look at all of your processes to make sure that they're robust in the face of deepfake attacks, that you should, not be, authorizing fairly, significant transactions of importance, such as, large financial transactions or sharing of sensitive data without some form of more rigorous process, if you like, that can determine that, that's authorized and whatnot as well. So there's lots of methods to verify, if you like, but in terms of who you trust, I don't think that changes, but you need to be much more careful about
diligent, I think.
Yeah, can you trust the identity of who you're actually interacting with?
Yeah, very much so. I think of it as broadening. We were diligent with phishing emails. We must be diligent around that, but this is just a broader aspect of that. Continuing to be diligent and not feel rushed into making decisions that feel a bit unusual. I think it's true. But yeah, I think it's a great answer, Brian. Remote recruitment, I think it's a really interesting one. Something that even Integrity, we put in place processes regarding this. But any advice for remote recruitment, Brian, regarding the impersonation aspect?
Yeah, so I think that that we have to be much more careful, because if you think about, if you recruit entirely remotely, then I think just relying on digital verification methods, in terms of people sending in their, accreditations, their, proving their identity, the same form of quite rigorous KYC processes that are under attack through deepfakes. You should have a KYE process, know your employee, and to make sure they are who you think they are. And we've had, we actually offer a service where we a resource augmentation service where we source candidates for some of our clients and place them with the clients, and we do all the screening and all the rest of it. And we have a process where one of the team meets the person in IRL to verify them in the whatever country they're being hired. So I think you need to either physically verify or at least have some very, very rigorous process to validate identity, because I think otherwise you are at risk of these type of attacks.
Yeah, definitely. Ideally, don't do it, I think is the answer. Have sort of physical verification. Yeah. I there's a couple of few interesting questions here actually. So, where do we think what does the future look like, Brian, for this? What does the evolution look like for deepfakes and AI?
I think that in the near future, like you're seeing the models just rapidly accelerating, multi-mode AI, generative AI. So generating at the moment, like for example, when I was doing some of these examples, I was generating the voice separately, and then I was taking an image and generating the video, and then I was putting the all together. But now with multimodal generative AI, you can just, I think very soon you'll be able to give an identity, give it some imagery and a voice sample, and basically get it to construct anything you want and use that. And then also that appearance of doing that, not just pre-generated, obviously, which is great for some aspects of social engineering and for misinformation, but then more and more becoming available in real time, so that you can literally fake someone. So I think that's very near term. And those tools becoming available and injecting them into all the standard forms of digital communications. So I think that's almost here, if not here already. So that's like weeks and months and not years away. And then I think that, if you look very long term, I think, there is it feels like an episode of Black Mirror, right? But you see all of these examples now of humanoid looking robots, who are dancing and walking around and very human in appearance. So I think, I'm not sure how far it is away where you could impersonate somebody's identity with a humanoid robot, but I'd say it's somewhere there in the future. So that'll be an interesting future to deal with. I don't know if that's 10 years, 100 years, or what, but it's somewhere in that range where, we'll probably in some future situation also be dealing with not just in the digital sphere, but in the physical, real life sphere as well.
Yeah, very much so. I actually had to go off camera because I was having some latency issues there earlier, but then I began to question, was I actually a bot or not? I wasn't quite sure. I thought I was sort of stuck in some sort of strange place, so I thought I'd better come back on camera just to prove I was actually real. But yeah, I think it's really interesting, Brian. It's a good question here from Richard as well. Thanks, Richard. How can we elaborate on real-time behavioral analysis and AI detection tools to adapt on oh my god, I'm not doing a very good job of this, to adapt on evolving tactics? I'll start this actually. Brian's for me, this is the answer to this lies in terms of zero trust for me. This is a putting in place the correct mechanisms to prevent what could be an impersonation from proliferating into an environment. I think absolutely a strategy for organizations should be putting in place and driving towards zero trust adoption to limit potential access and control into an organization should things become something. But of course, there are tools on the marketplace today to help with AI deception detection tools and so on and so forth. So for me, I would take a different slant on that question. I'll be starting to ask a question of the business. Where are we going on our zero trust? Where are we on our zero trust strategy? Brian, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that question.
No, and I wasn't clear from the question whether the AI deception tools are, deception technology within, the defender's environment in order to act as honeypots to pick up on the attackers, or whether we mean deception as in deepfakery using AI from the attacker perspective. So you can look at it in both different ways, but adapting to evolving attacker tactics is something we deal with all the time, so, and I think it is an arms race, isn't it, between the evolving AI being used on the defender side versus the adversary side. And I think that AI is both, a headache for us, but it's also a tool we can use to help defend against it. And a lot of the the advent of AI within security is to pick up on anomalies. So you're not actually just looking for a known behavior that you recognize, like going back to the old days of signature-based AV or whatever, but rather you pick up on anomalous activity, as in it's not what you normally see in the environment. So all those, a lot of those capabilities are there. So I think that remains to be an important armory in our defenses, but it wouldn't be specific just to the deepfakes, if you like, but more generally part of a security posture.
Yeah. Yeah, great. I agree, Brian. Brian, obviously we are at time. There's one more question outstanding, which I'm going to. Can we quickly cover that, Brian? Let's if anyone's staying around, let's do a quick 30 seconds on that. In what ways might AI-driven deception inadvertently harm legitimate users or erode trust in digital systems? That's a good question. That one.
Well, AI-driven deception, presumably then an attacker. We're talking about someone who's using deception, using these AI techniques, such as deepfakes. How can it harm legitimate users? It can harm them by compromising, by getting them to share things that they shouldn't share, or to share their credentials, or in the case of, misinformation, disinformation, it can damage their reputation by placing them in situations that they haven't actually been in. So I think that one's fairly obvious.
Yeah.
Eroding trust in digital systems, I think, as well. Like, if you can't really trust who you're dealing with, already people are, you get a text message and it says, your post has been delayed until you pay this, and you click on this. Already you're never sure what to trust anymore about what's from a genuine actor versus not. So, and I think deepfakes is only making that more difficult for people. Even people quite educated and knowledgeable struggle with it to some extent and can be fooled. So for the general population that might be less savvy, it's even worse and should be more wary. So I think it does. I think it does erode trust, and it's something that we have to constantly work on to educate people as how to reliably work in this environment.
Agree, Brian. Yeah. Brian, if you quickly just flick on, I'll close in terms of the next webinars. Anyone, if you're looking for the slides, please reach out to myself or Brian, and we can gladly share those. There is also some of these are pre-recorded. Some of these are recorded from our Security First events on YouTube as well. So if you want to watch any of this back, feel free to do so. So upcoming webinars, guys. We work hard at this sort of content, Brian, and our CTO office work very hard at running these types of sessions. So I'd encourage you to join future webinars, please. The more relevant one at the moment, the retail ransomware surge, a conversation between our CTO and major incident response, fireside chat conversation. Very, very relevant, very tangible to the UK and I. Appreciate that this is an international webinar now, but I would very much encourage people to attend all our webinars. We will close there. Thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you for staying on throughout the session. Thank you, Brian, and have a great rest of the day, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.